All right. Well, it's 7:02, so I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. If that's, I hope that that is fine with everyone. Uh, Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dr. Joseph Zompetti. I'm a professor in the School of Communication, and I teach classes in rhetoric and political communication. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about myself in just a moment. But before I do, I want to thank from deep down, I want to thank the School of Communication Promotions and Development Committee, also known as the SOCPD, which is a committee run by students in the School of Communication who do planning and preparation for a number of events for the school. And so they are co-hosting this event with another group that I want to thank, and that's the Center for Civic Engagement at Illinois State University. So thank you very much to both groups for planning and organizing and promoting this event. I deeply appreciate it. And so about me, a little bit about me. Oh, and I should also thank Dr. Nathan Carpenter, who is uh, is my go-to person for all things technology, and also a very well versed and published professor on these sorts of things in his own right. So he might chime in here and there as well. Um, Tonight. And in fact, we just recently published an article with Dr. Lauren Brodslavsky on political polarization that occurs on Twitter. So if any of you are interested in that, we'll be happy to get you that citation. But so anyway, again, my name is Dr. Joseph Zompetti, and I've been teaching a particular class on political polarization that I call divisive discourse. And for those of you who know anything about the course catalog, it's COM 303, Controversy in Contemporary Society, and I've been teaching this class since about 2014. And so before 2014, I started researching this particular area of political communication. And then in 2015, I wrote a book called Divisive Discourse, The Extreme Rhetoric of Contemporary American Politics. And I use that book obviously in the class that I teach because there really is no equivalent book, at least in the field of communication, that looks at divisive, polarizing political talk from a communication perspective, which is sort of ironic since we have a lot of other people publishing on how to talk about politics, but very few people who come from the communication field. And so anyway, I thought that that was a pretty big gap in the literature, and it was difficult for me to find a text for my class. And so I wrote this book, and it's now in its second edition. And essentially, what it does is a couple of chapters in the beginning are theoretical in nature, which is for the most part what we're going to be kind of talking about tonight. And then the remaining chapters of the book cover major controversial issues in society, things like immigration, healthcare, religion, race, foreign policy issues, and so forth. And we talk about that as a class, and we talk about both the liberal side of arguments as well as the conservative side of arguments, and any other kinds of positions that may exist as well. We talk about the historical context of these issues. But before we do all of that, so in the beginning of the semester, we really try to lay the groundwork of what it's like to have a conversation, particularly a conversation that is controversial, knowing that there are going to be people who disagree with us, knowing that there are going to be differences of opinion. And how do we have a meaningful, productive, and respectful conversation about these kinds of issues, yeah, even with folks who disagree with us, right? And so that's what the class is about. So try to lay that groundwork, try to create a climate and an atmosphere where people feel both comfortable and uncomfortable talking about these issues, but at least doing so in a way where they can speak to one another in a respectful and civil way. And I have to say that, so since I've been teaching this class since about 2015, since I wrote the book, and I've been teaching it just about every semester, it has been, I think, incredibly successful. And most of my students, I think, would vouch for this. Some may not, but I think by the time we get to the end of the semester, most students feel more comfortable talking about politics and talking about political issues that are controversial, in nature. What's somewhat, on one hand, kind of funny, and on the other hand, not so funny, is that when I first started the class before the 2016 presidential election, I had students and others come to me and say, "Oh, Dr. Zompetti, this sounds like a great class. What a perfect time to have this class people are so divided in America. People don't know how to have conversations, about politics in America. So, gosh, everybody should have this class. And of course, this semester, I have saying the exact same thing. But I have to say that I think that now, more than ever, this class and classes like it and the kind of subject matter that we're going to be talking about tonight, which I know I'm not the only one who does on campus, is actually more important now than ever. And so I want to give a shout out to folks at CTLT who have a program that they occasionally sponsor about how to having controversial conversations in the classroom. So from a pedagogical perspective, that's definitely worth checking out. I've been to it. I can vouch for it. It's good stuff. I think you all will learn important material from that. I also want to give a shout out to my colleagues in psychology who have the Empathy Project, who have colloquia. I don't know exactly how frequent it is, maybe once a month, I think, where folks talk about empathy in various ways. And that's certainly related to the material we'll be talking tonight. And I also know that occasionally folks in politics and government and sociology, social work, and other areas around campus also breach this topic. So I am certainly not the only one, and I'm not an expert in all things controversial, but I do hope that I can provide some insight tonight, at least from a communication perspective, on how to deal with at least political controversy in our everyday conversations. All right, so I want to kind of start with a little bit of an icebreaker. I know in Zoom world, it's a little challenging to do some of these kinds of things. So I'm just going to ask three somewhat rhetorical questions just to get you to start thinking. And we're probably not going to call on people because it looks like we're very well attended tonight, which is fantastic. So just kind of think about these. And if you're with someone, certainly talk about it amongst yourselves. I'll give folks a couple of minutes to sort of digest the question and kind of think about your answer. But the first question is this: what are three emotions that come to mind when you hear the words political polarization? So, what are three emotions that come to mind? And I think it may evoke different things in different people. So, political polarization. The next question is this: who are three people that you associate with political polarization? Name three people that you associate with political polarization. And I imagine whoever you name might say something more about you than it does them, actually. And then finally, do you avoid or embrace these types of conversations? And kind of think for a moment, well, why do you avoid them or why do you embrace them? So, what are three emotions that come to mind when you hear the words political polarization? Who are three people you associate with the concept of political polarization? And do you avoid or embrace these kinds of conversations and why? So, as you think about those and as you think about your answers, I think it tells, as I already kind of indicated, I think the answers to these questions tell us a lot more about ourselves, and that's really one of the goals for tonight. Is what can we learn about ourselves as we move forward? Okay, uh, because we can't really change the behavior or the attitudes of others. We can try to convince and persuade others, of course. We can try to be good role models for others, but that's really their choice how they deal with that, right? So what's in our sphere of control? And that's the kinds of things we consume in terms of media. It's what we think about, it's how we think about things, and it's certainly how we act on how we feel and whatever our knowledge is. And so tonight, I hope that we keep that perspective in mind, right? Is that uh, a lot of these conversations that we enter in with other people or that we hear coming from the mouths of other people, we can choose to either engage it or not. We can choose to turn the channel on our television. We can choose to listen to other types of media. We can choose to act upon how we feel in healthy ways or in unhealthy ways. And I think it's really, really important as we talk tonight to think about taking a pause and kind of process what's going on, what kind of language people are using, what kind of language we're thinking about using, and digest that in a little bit, and then perhaps enter the conversation if we think we're ready and prepared, or not enter that conversation, right? Take a break from it, regroup, or never talk to that person about that material again. Or, if it's a really healthy or unhealthy or toxic kind of situation. But in any case, we have options. And I think that's one of the things hopefully you'll take away from tonight is that we don't necessarily have to feel overwhelmed or overburdened or have a sort of a doom and gloom attitude about these kinds of conversations because we do have options. So anyway, hopefully that gets you thinking a little bit. So tonight, I want to talk a little bit about some of the causes of political polarization. And again, this is coming from a communication perspective. I'm sure that there are some other causes or other variables in mind that that might come to your mind, as I talk, and that's fine. And we can certainly talk about that when I'm done, because we're going to have quite a bit of time, hopefully, for discussion and questions and answers after my little talk here. So feel free to bring those up and maybe try to link them to some of the things I'm talking about. But I'm going to talk about some of the causes, and then I'm going to address some of the possible ways to uh, deal with these controversial discussions about politics. And I'm going to actually be drawing directly from my book. And when we get to that point, I'll actually put those pages from my book in a screen share so you can actually see how they are written in the book. Okay, so I have 6 causes that I've thought about for tonight that I think are worth mentioning. The first cause of the political polarization that we see in the American context, and that's what I'm talking about here, because certainly there's political polarization all over the planet. But in the American context, I think that ideology is something that is something we should definitely consider. So, a person's particular political ideology obviously is the way they see the world. So, if they put on red sunglasses, they see the world in red. If they put on yellow sunglasses, they see the world in yellow. So, if they're wearing conservative sunglasses, they're going to see the world from a conservative perspective. Liberal, a liberal perspective. Socialist will see it from a socialist perspective, and so on. Right. So, the ideology is what helps construct and create our notion of reality, and that's how we see the world. And as a result, messages that are focused or premised on that ideology help to also constitute our identity. If someone asks you, "Oh, well, who did you vote for, or what political party did you vote for?" and you say, "Oh, I voted for the Republican Party," well, then that becomes part of your identity. Particularly if you vote in the primary, then that becomes a matter of public record and is, at least in most states, I think. So that's part of your identity. But it's also something that many of us also self-identify as, right? If somebody were to ask you, okay, well, how do you fall along the political spectrum? Most people will label themselves according to labels that have already been constructed and defined by others. So, yeah, I'm a progressive, or I'm a Republican, or I'm a libertarian, or whatever those categories might be. Some people, of course, eschew those categories and they'll say, "Oh, well, I'm an independent, or I'm a moderate, or I don't really fall along any kind of political ideology. I just kind of vote for the person." Well, even those are ideological in nature. And so they all help to constitute who we are and how we see things. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, nothing in a vacuum, right? But often what happens is that our identities, based upon these ideological constructions, uh, are often seen as fodder for argumentative attacks by opposing forces. And sometimes we also feel personally attacked if we think our identities are at stake. So, in other words, instead of me just saying, "Hey, I'm a Republican, I voted Republican in the last primary, and then someone then starts bashing Republicans, instead of me saying, well, I'm not that kind of a Republican, or I only voted Republican this one time, or I voted Republican for these particular issues, instead of qualifying it and kind of seeing ourselves or distancing ourselves from the overgeneralizations that others are making, sometimes we feel instead that they are personally attacking us. And when that happens, of course, we may react in kind, and the conversation, of course, devolves as a result. Sometimes the ideology that's dictating these arguments can feel like they're in your face, right? Somebody's really vehement, they're really passionate about whatever it is that they believe, and if they feel like they're really coming across as too strong. And when that happens, we might feel like the conversation is becoming pretty heated pretty quickly. When in reality, it might be something to celebrate that somebody's actually that excited about politics that they're, that they're advocating that, with that kind of energy. Maybe that's a good thing. But I think that, of course, the types of words they're used and the way they do it are also indicators that we should factor in, right? And then lastly, about ideology or identity that I want to mention is that sometimes I think that that we feel, or at least some of us feel, that we are being bombarded by a particular message, or being bombarded by a particular point of view. That, yeah, okay, I can kind of see it, see where they're coming from, but geez, I wish that they would just cool it for a while. Is kind of the attitude that I hear some people express. And I'm not really sure there's an easy answer to that one, because if you feel pretty passionately about whatever the issue is or whatever your ideology is, you want to make sure that people hear it, right? And repetition can be a positive a rhetorical tactic. But for some folks, who are hearing that message, they might feel like they're being oversaturated. So those are some things to consider in terms of ideology. A second cause that we see in terms of political polarization, and this one's an easy one, are the political extremists. The political extremists that exist. For any of you who have been watching the news for the past 24, 48 hours, there's been a lot of coverage about a representative from Georgia named Taylor Greene, Marjorie Taylor Greene, yeah. And in some of the comments that she's made, particularly on social media, one of which apparently she said something to the effect of how she would like to see a bullet in Nancy Pelosi's head. A lot of people are interpreting that as her advocating and endorsing an execution of somebody in the opposing party. I don't know if that's exactly what she meant or not, but certainly I think that kind of rhetoric is really alarming, and probably you know um, should should really be called into question, particularly from someone who's supposed to represent us in government, right? I mean, it's one thing to say that people have a First Amendment right and freedom of expression, but I think it's another when we have a representative who's supposed to be representing all the people, right? Not just a particular ideological point of view, who's saying these kinds of things. And so it's pretty scary, right? And I only use her as an example because that's the most salient and most recent that's on my mind. We have other examples, of course, not just from conservatives, but from liberals as well. If you will recall, a couple of years ago, there were some folks in the Trump administration who were eating dinner, and folks in the restaurant, the owners of the restaurant, decided not to serve them because they disagreed with Trump's policies on immigration. A couple days, that was a very heated moment, and a couple days later, Maxine Waters, representative from California, Democrat, came out and said that all Democrats who see these kinds of Republicans and these folks from the Trump administration, you should feel like it's within your rights to refuse them service and to call them out and to kick them out of establishments. And that was pretty polarizing. So instead of our representatives trying to find ways of seeking common ground and building consensus and getting things done for the American people as a whole, we see examples on both sides, both Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals, engaging in this sort of toxic discourse. And so they, as John Avlon wrote in his book called Wingnuts, these folks hijack our conversations, and they sometimes become role models for others, right? So what I often tell my class is, we don't usually have classes that teach us how to have conversations, much less political conversations. And so how do we learn how to engage in this kind of talk? Well, we typically parrot or mimic the behavior of others. And if it's the extremists that are getting most of the coverage and attention, or some of them are the ones dominating the airwaves or social media platforms, then that's really all we get exposed to. And so it seems to me that it's kind of natural that some of our fellow citizens, maybe even our neighbors or folks in our classrooms or in our faculty meetings, might be parroting some of these same kinds of rhetorical tactics because that's what they're used to, that's what they're exposed to. So they mimic the behavior of these pundits. Could be politicians like Maxine Waters or Marjorie Taylor Greene. It could be journalists that they mimic. It could also be family members, right? Some of our family members are very toxic in the way they communicate, and dare I say, maybe even some of our educators, right? Engage in some of this kind of talk, and we should be careful, I think, how we engage in our own sort of communicating patterns and behaviors, and be careful who we use as role models. So that was an easy one. The third cause, I think, is also an easy one and is a group that is often the brunt of attacks, and that's the media, right? Trump called the mainstream media the enemy of the people. So he would certainly attack the media writ large. And even at the time when he said that, he was lauding and praising Fox News at the time. But then toward the end of his presidency, he even hated Fox News, uh, which, as we know, tends to be pretty conservative. But we know that the cable television news networks, MSNBC, CNN, and Fox News, are not the only ones involved in this mess. We know that social media platforms perpetuate or often um, beacons for some of this kind of rhetoric. We know that a lot of the festering sort of white supremacist rhetoric that we've heard a lot about since January 6th has occurred in social media platforms, some more overt than others. But the point is that the media are involved not so much in uh, being gatekeepers of the content of the messages, but rather just making sure that messages are disseminated if there's someone who puts money in their pocketbooks, right? So a lot of these folks are interested in ratings, they're interested in market shares and stock prices and things of that nature. So they don't really monitor that much about the content. We're seeing a little bit of that change, obviously, since Trump has been purged from every major social media platform. But a lot of the rhetoric still continues in all forms of social media. So it's not just television and it's not just social media. We should also remember that there is radio that people listen to. Bill Press wrote a book not too long ago called Toxic Talk, which is about uh, about how talk radio has largely been co-opted by extreme conservative viewpoints. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to that, obviously, but for the most part, particularly in sort of middle and rural America, the airwaves have been dominated by some relatively extremist kind of conservative views. And so what we see then is what people are exposed to helps shape their reality. And that may not necessarily be their fault, although we all have choices, right? We could flip the switch, we could change the dial on our radio, we could stop listening to social media or change the groups that we sign up for in social media. We do have some degree of autonomy, or it's not like we're a bunch of robots. But at the same time, we are being exposed to this kind of information, and it does shape how we see the world. And so the media, I think, certainly are partially culpable in our political polarization. A couple other things I would just want to add before I move into possible solutions. The fourth is we're limited by our language, um, and others use that to their advantage. So we also know that we have short attention spans. Most Americans don't know that much about politics. We had record numbers, of course, vote in the last presidential election, but even still, a lot of those folks don't know that much about the political process or about current events, or they may know a little bit about some things, but they don't have much depth, right? And their understanding of what some of these controversial issues entail. And so we're limited then in our knowledge, but then other people take advantage of that by using labels, by using characterizations and overgeneralizations to describe mostly what the other side thinks. Okay, so let me just give you a quick example of that, which I think is an obvious one, and that is the abortion debate. So one side tends to be identify as, or even be described as, pro-life, right? And the other side being described as pro-choice. Well, if you disagree with the pro-life folks, does that mean you're anti-life? That's sort of the next logical extension of that, isn't it? So just the name of that particular political position already sort of stacks the argumentative deck, if you will, in such a way that our language will be used to position people as either being pro-life or pro-murder, right? When in reality, people that are not pro-life in the political sense are not out here advocating murder, right? They're advocating something else entirely. But our language constrains us. And instead of being really specific about what it is we mean, we put these labels and stamps on concepts, and that's what then emerges in our political discourse as mental shortcuts, as linguistic shortcuts, and that can create obviously a lot of problems in our conversations. Number 5 is another cause, I think, of political polarization, which can also be part of our solution, but is emotions. Emotions, I think, and again, political scientists who are joining us can certainly probably speak to this more than I can. But I think that in the last decade or so, we've seen a shift from more sort of reason-based policymaking to more affective-based policymaking. So policymaking and arguments about policies that are based largely on the way people feel about them, as opposed to some of the facts or reasons behind them. And that, of course, coincides with the increasing questioning of facts, right? A distrust in science, a questioning of, what does it mean to even have facts or have alternative facts? This notion of fake news. All of this, of course, is happening at the same time that other uh, policies are being implemented or being advocated that are largely affectively based. And I think that that could pose a real problem, particularly if you don't share those emotions, right? So if somebody else feels really, really strongly about something, this is why I asked that one icebreaker question, like what are those emotions that come to your mind when you think of political polarization? Well, some people might feel really, really excited and energized. Others might feel very, very scared and afraid. And often some of those emotions do not gel very well. And when they don't, they can be combustible in our conversations. And finally, number 6, one of the causes of political polarization, and I've already kind of hinted at this, and that is that we just don't know how to talk about this stuff. And so some people recoil at the thought of having controversial conversations. And like a shark, some political pundits smell blood and they go after those folks. Others, get energized and excited and jump into these conversations, but they don't really know what they're talking about. And for the rest of us, we just sometimes forget to hit the pause button and think before we utter our mouth. And sometimes stuff comes out of our mouth that we regret later. And in the meantime, the conversation has gone sideways. So anyway, those are 6 causes of political polarization from a communication perspective that I think what we can think about. So I'm going to take just a little pause here, take a drink of my Diet Pepsi. And now I want to screen share with you 20 things that I talk about that come from my book. Okay? So give me a second here as I try to figure out how to do that. Go to screen share. And here it is. Okay. Nate, can you see that? Okay, good. So number 1, is the one that is stressed in the workshop at CTLT. That's the thing and this is the number one piece of advice that I have read throughout all of my research on how to engage in controversial conversations. And that is, we all need to learn how to listen better. Uh, I don't know about some of you, but when I engage in political talk, my natural instinct is to think about how I'm going to respond to somebody's argument as soon as they start saying it. And the whole time they're talking, I'm thinking about my response. Yet, if I would just chill out and listen to what they have to say, I might learn something and I might even agree with something, right? Uh, and at the very least, I might also realize that it may not be something worth responding to. But I can't do that if I don't listen first. And so this is a real problem for me. And I think it's a real problem for a lot of people. And again, we don't normally take classes on how to listen. We're not really taught how to listen, at least listen carefully, and to put ourselves in the other person's shoes while listening. Um, and again, sometimes these conversations, they shouldn't necessarily be about trying to win an argument, and which is actually one of my points in a minute, but it should be about trying to listen to where the other person's coming from. And as we listen, think about maybe follow-up questions like, okay, well, you just talked about, blah, blah, blah. Well, why do you feel that way about blah, blah, blah? Uh, how did you come to think about this in that particular way, so that we can learn more from them, as opposed to trying to put them in their place or make sure that our voices are heard over theirs, as if it's a yelling match. So listening is extremely vital, I think. Probably the most important thing we can do. Uh, Number two, and I mentioned this above too, is to think before responding. Um, my dad always used to tell me to think before I engaged my mouth. And because as I was growing up, I loved to talk and I would love to say things, and it would often get me into trouble. So um, his advice rings true to me today more than it ever did when I was a kid, because most of the time I just ignored him when I was a kid. But today it really rings true to me. And I think it's really important advice for all of us, that instead of a knee jerk reaction to just jump in and say whatever's on our mind, it may be important for us to, again, hit that pause button and reflect and think about, marinate on what is going on from the other person, and what's going on inside of us. Why do I feel this way? Why, this is a person who's trying to talk to me. Why do I feel so angry all of a sudden? Are they attacking me, or are they attacking some idea that maybe I should just chill out about? And if I invest all of this energy and worry and in frustration in this particular conversation, is it really worth it? And is it worth it that I might lose a friend or a family member over this? These are calculations that we should be having in our head, but we're not. Instead, most of us just jump right in. We fall for we take the bait and we fall for it, and then it causes us more grief later. And number three here is to think of the other person as someone special. Um, we often think of the other person as less than us or inferior to us, or they're making dumb arguments, or I can't believe that somebody would think that or believe that, so they must be crazy or an idiot. Or we may even see them as the enemy, someone that I could never really be a friend to, or I can't even believe I'm talking to this person, right? Those are the wrong kinds of ways of thinking about people, if we are going to have a conversation with them. Now, maybe you feel that way and you don't want to have a conversation with them, and that's fine. But if we're going to have a conversation with someone and we're going to invest that kind of energy in it, we should probably treat that other person with a modicum amount of respect, just as we would hope they would do that for us. And even if they don't do it for us, we should be the better person. We should be the ones who at least take a position that that is a step in the right direction. And maybe they'll follow, maybe they won't. But again, that's under our sphere of control. You can't do anything about what they're going to do. Number four, Remember that people are seldom wrong 100% of the time. Uh, Now, I guess maybe some people are wrong 100% of the time, but most people aren't. And most of the conversations that we will have with folks, they might say something that has some truth to it, or some validity to it, or some value to it. And maybe they reach a conclusion that we don't reach or that we disagree with, but there might be something in that conversation that we can agree with, or that maybe you're wrong about. And that's possible, right? We're all humans, we all make mistakes, and maybe we're just wrong about something, and the other side is calling us out. And so instead of belaboring our inadequacies, maybe we should take a pause and admit when we're wrong, and then move from there. It's possible, and I think it's something that we should consider. Number 6 is we should anticipate these kinds of conversations, know what we're getting into, or at least the best we can. Sometimes these things happen, off the cuff, organically, extemporaneously, and we can't really prepare, but we can prepare for how we handle certain things, I think, even if we don't know specifically when they're going to happen, and kind of give ourselves a little bit of latitude, show ourselves a little bit of grace, and forgive ourselves for, some conversations we've had in the past, and learn from that. Learn how we could have done better, and then deploy how we could have done better in our future conversations. This also goes true for, I think, a point that I have coming up, and that is, if we anticipate that the conversation is going to get ugly real fast, and that's outside of our control, then it may be something we want to avoid entirely. Right. And I certainly don't want to encourage folks to use my suggestions and then get involved in a conversation that inflicts emotional or physical harm on them. Um, Certainly, if you think that the conversation is going to go down that kind of an alley, then you should cut and run. You should just get out of it as fast as possible. And certainly those kinds of conversations are not worth having at all. But if it's a conversation with someone that you care about, or somebody that you think you might care about, or if it's a conversation about a topic you care about, or if it's in a classroom kind of a situation, then I think that there are things that we can prepare for and anticipate. And again, there are other resources that you can draw on to help you do that besides just this talk tonight. Number 7, I think, is to be well informed. We should know what we're talking about. And this means to have a degree of breadth to our knowledge, not just depth of our knowledge, not just breadth. In other words, we shouldn't just know what's in the headlines, or what people are retweeting in 280 characters, but we should also know what the arguments are. We should know what the opposition thinks. We should know why the opposition thinks that way. And in so doing, we will be much better prepared when we have these kinds of conversations. And so that means exposing ourselves, and this is another tip I have in a minute, but expose ourselves to different media outlets, expose ourselves to different ways of thinking, so that we can be better informed, okay? And yeah, and that's number 8, diversify our media exposure and our sources of information. Do not fall prey to the echo chambers and the media filter bubbles, those silos of information, where you're only exposed to a certain type of reality. Try to broaden your perspectives. Challenge yourself. Like, if you're a liberal, investigate right-wing sources. Watch Fox News. Listen to talk radio that's conservative. See what the other side is saying, and try to see why they're saying that. Why are they coming at it from that perspective? Yeah, you might still disagree with them at the end of the day, but at least now you'll know why they feel that way, as opposed to assuming you know why they feel that way, which is often a reason why these kinds of talks get polarized and ugly. Number 9, this has been controversial with some folks who have read number 9 and number 10, and that is, but I think that it's worth considering. Okay, and that is, so number 9 is, try to remember that the boogeyman is not underneath every bed. In other words, um, don't don't think that every time someone who's not like you is always out to get you. Don't think that they're always that every time they say something, it's about you, first of all, because newsflash, the earth doesn't revolve around you. And what they're saying isn't always a personal attack against you. But number 10 is to temper that. And that is that sometimes they are out to get you, and sometimes it is about you. And so we need to develop more competent conversational skills so that we can discern one situation from the next, so that we can get a better gauge on, well, when is it someone is attacking me versus when is it someone's just flying off the cuff or babbling something, or they're making generalizations and that those generalizations don't apply to me. You know, when can we know the difference? And these are largely contextual. They're largely based on whomever the person is that we're engaged with the conversation. So it's not, there's no magical formula to figure this out. It just requires practice and experience and careful reflection, which all of us need to do more of, right? But I just think that it's worth noting that not everybody who disagrees with us is out to get us, but sometimes they are. And we should try to be mindful of that. Number 11 is we should try to challenge ourselves to see the world from the perspective of others. Now, I'm not saying that you have to agree with them, but one of the assignments in my class is I have students write about an extremist who engages in political discourse who is a liberal, and then they have to analyze the discourse the extreme discourse of somebody who is a conservative. And so if they're a liberal, if the student is a liberal, they have to research how liberals are engaging in this kind of toxic talk. And if they're a conservative, they have to do the same thing with a conservative. And then they also have to do the same kind of research for the other side. So they have to question their own beliefs. They have to see where the other side is coming from. They have to understand the rhetorical techniques that both sides are using. And it forces the student, I think, to see the world in a slightly different way. I have had some students who come to me and say, wow, I'm a conservative, but I wrote my paper about Donald Trump, and I now am really nervous about calling myself a Republican because I don't like some of the things that he said. Well, okay, that's good. You're thinking, right? That's what I want you to do, as I want you to think. At the end of the day, you should, still be a Republican. You could even still support Trump, but at least now you're thinking about it, right? And you're able to process the reasons why you feel this way and the reasons why you engage in these kinds of conversations, as opposed to just doing it out of some sort of response because maybe your family does it or your friends do it or whatever. Now at least you're processing it and thinking about it. And if we think about where other people are coming from, we start to also see their humanity, at least a lot of times. Okay, maybe not in every instance, but if we can feel the pain and frustration that is dictating how some people feel, right? And this is why they believe what they believe. There's room there for us to possibly connect. Uh, a lot of the folks who stormed the Capitol on January 6th were talking about how they were upset at the way the economy has gone, that some of them have lost their jobs, and they're really upset because in pre-COVID, Trump was doing great things with the economy, but they see all this as the Democrats' fault. Well, I mean, that's something that I think a lot of us can relate to, right? The economy has been hurting all of us. Now, we might disagree with their diagnosis. We certainly may disagree with how they responded to it, but for some of them, again, not all of them, but for some of them, they were articulating feelings of frustration that reveal their humanity, and that I think that we could maybe find some commonality with, which allows us to open the door for having some productive conversations. But we can't do that if we don't ask questions and if we don't try to see where some folks are coming from. Number 13 is to be, number 12, slow down the conversation. And this goes in part with hitting that pause button, taking a break. Number 13 is to be in the moment, be present, avoid distractions. Don't check your email account or your Instagram feed if you want to make sure that this conversation is taken seriously. And by the way, it's also pretty disrespectful to the other person, right? If you're being distracted like that. Number 14 is engage in interpersonal communication. And we have classes, entire classes on this in the School of Comm. But essentially what that means is to be respectful of the other person, to be mindful of certain conversational cues. Like if there's a little pause, that means that maybe you can interject, but don't interrupt. Watch nonverbal cues, things like that that can help you better get a feel and a read on the situation and the context. Number 15 is similar to uh, think before you utter your mouth. Right? Choose our words carefully, and remember too. And this is slightly different than that one in the sense that remember that our language constrains us. Remember the example that I used about pro-life, pro-choice. Just because some people use certain words doesn't mean that's actually what they mean. Uh, they are falling victim to how perhaps others are using those words. And we need to be mindful of that. And I also think that when we choose our words, we need to be mindful of that. We need to be careful not to generalize or overgeneralize, use qualifying words like some people believe or most people believe, or those kinds of qualifying words. Because if you just say, hey, you know what, I really can't stand Republicans because they all think blah, blah, blah. Well, then if you're talking to a Republican, you've already categorized them like that when they may not be that kind of a Republican. There are differences, there are nuances, and there are complexities that we should be mindful of. Number 16 should be obvious, but it's not. And that is when we engage in these conversations, if we want to be treated a certain way, then we should probably treat the other person that way. And again, the other person may not treat us with respect and tolerance. And again, if it becomes pretty toxic, you should get out of that situation. But you want to try to be the better person, and you want to try to make sure that the conversation can go a certain way, and you can only control what you do. So I'm suggesting that we embrace the golden rule whenever and as much as we can. And that goes in part with number 17, which is really hard. I think it's a natural instinct in American political discourse to immediately attribute blame. I mean, how did I even start the conversation tonight? I started with the causes of political polarization, right? I am even guilty of this because we often think about causes, solutions, right? Causes the problem, and then the solution. Well, the cause is often part of this blame game. So I could easily just say, well, liberals are the cause because they're the ones who want everybody to be able to express their feelings. And what that means is that some people feel like they can just willy-nilly say whatever they want, and that causes these kinds of conversations to go down the tube real fast. I could say that, but is that really healthy or productive? No, it's not. And it may not even be all that accurate. So playing the blame game often doesn't get us very far. Now, sometimes it may be important to find some causes, particularly if the problem is a complex one. But to blame certain people, or let me say, not certain people, individuals, I think we can certainly do that because I think some individuals need to be held accountable. But to blame maybe entire groups, and cast that kind of a wide net in a generalizing way usually isn't very productive or healthy. Number 18, I think it's okay to try to convince other people how you feel and what you think is right and what you think facts are, and if you believe a certain position. But we should also be mindful that these conversations shouldn't necessarily be about trying to convince someone of something. In fact, if we can sort of reorient the way we view these conversations as less about a competition or less about persuading people and more about learning from each other, then I think that will help us, particularly in a classroom situation, right? It helps us tremendously. If you're just saying, hey, I just want to learn from you. I'm still probably going to disagree with you, but tell me how you came to that conclusion. Tell me what your experiences are that make you see the world this way. Why do you feel this way when someone does X, Y, or Z? Then that broadens my horizon. That broadens my perspective of things. Again, I may not agree with it, but at least it increases and expands my understanding. Number 19 is to understand argument. And coming from a debate background, this is pretty important to me. But the idea here is that is to try to shift at least a little bit from this affect-centered political discourse to more of a reason-based focus of political discourse, to try to come up with arguments about political positions. So having evidence, having reasons, then formulating your conclusions, as opposed to this is how I feel, so I just expect other people to kind of fall in line. I think that moving toward an argument-based form of discourse can help us in that respect, and may not be useful or important or productive in all instances, but it is a suggestion I think worth considering in some contexts. And finally, the big picture. One of the axioms that I am fond of saying is, don't lose sight of the forest because we're staring at a tree. And this is particularly true in conversations with friends and family members. You get into a conversation with someone, is that particular conversation really worth losing a friend or a family member over? In the grand scheme of things, is that conversation really going to matter that much to you and to them? It may matter in a negative way, but it's probably not going to matter in a positive way. And so the risks are too great. So we should pick and choose our battles, I guess is what I'm saying. We should also try to see the connections about how a particular conversation might impact other things down the road. And we should also remember that it's very, very rare that we're going to change someone's mind in a single conversation. Usually it's a process that people are persuaded by a process that requires cultivating, but there can be definite long-term damage from a single conversation. So thinking about it in those terms means I think that we should be a little bit more careful, a little bit more mindful about how we approach some of these conversations so that we don't do long-term damage or invoke trauma that can really affect people for a long time when they really aren't that important or shouldn't be that important. And we should remember that the other side is not the enemy. Well, at least they should, theoretically shouldn't be the enemy. That we're all Americans, we're all redbirds, we're all human beings, and we have to live on this planet, this country, and in this community together. And so we all have a vested interest in making sure that this community and this country and this planet are better. And so let's work together as opposed to against each other. I think that hopefully some of these suggestions can be helpful to you. I'm interested in your thoughts and certainly am available to answer any questions you might have. So let's open it up. We have until, I think this is scheduled to 8:30, so we've got plenty of time. So I know Dr. Carpenter, I'm going to get rid of the screen share here so that we can see people. And Dr. Carpenter is going to help me identify folks. So if you could raise your hand, either in the participant section or on your screen, or just physically raise your hand. Maybe we could see you that way, but we'll try to get to everybody if we can.
And if you are watching live on Facebook, feel free to leave your comments or questions in the comments section on our page as well. And we'll try to get back to you as soon as we can. I know there's about a 20-second delay.
I know I said a lot, so it may take a moment to digest. And maybe some people, Dr. Carpenter, are practicing the suggestion of think before engaging one's mouth. Hopefully I didn't upset anyone, but nevertheless, I appreciate the fact that some people are digesting and reflecting. Well, let me ask you this, Dr. Carpenter, while other people are thinking, because I have a question for you, because I know that you've studied this stuff too, and I don't know how much you talk about this in your classes, but what other advice would you offer to folks who are engaged in these kinds of discussions, whether it be in the class or with friends, family members, or someone at the bar or whatever? Those are the ones we definitely don't want to become too toxic, right? When alcohol is present. But what kind of advice would you give, or additional suggestions that maybe I didn't cover?
Yeah, I think one of them, when I was looking at your list, and there were some places that you were talking about big picture, but that big picture often looked at the immediate relationships with those with whom you are engaging in dialogue and conversation. And in many cases, I think about the aspects of polarization that are they really stand to benefit someone somewhere else somehow, right? If you think about, uh, so if I'm getting into a conversation and it's about a topic that I know is going to be heated, I'm often kind of, I encourage you to step back, or I encourage myself to step back and to say, if I get angry about this, and if I'm having this fight right now, um, who who does it benefit somewhere else, right? Who am I kind of helping that might even be completely against my cause, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about this. Really, one of the historians I follow on Twitter, his name is Kevin Cruz, and he is constantly in this like weird flame war with Dinesh D'Souza, who's a pretty right-wing commentator. And it's always going on, and almost every time something happens, Kevin Cruz stops and says, and by the way, Dinesh D'Souza is doing this so that he can have more, crazy whatever for some, book or movie or talking point that he wants to get across on Fox News tonight. I mean, that's kind of like what Kevin Cruz is able to recognize, that like when he's getting targeted, he knows it's because of a larger like media ecosystem. So I think that's something I want to encourage all of you to also think about, is when there are moments like this, or when there are topics like this, that especially get you riled up and angry and ready to break a bottle over a table. It's probably the worst example, but ask yourself who's benefiting from you being this upset or engaging in kind of um, unnecessarily uncivil dialogue.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes we don't even realize, right? If other people are in earshot, or if folks are going to take what we say and then run with it in other ways that maybe we don't intend, or maybe we do intend. Like Cruz might purposefully want people to retweet or repeat whatever he's saying in other venues. Um, and so we don't always know, which means that we need to be careful, that just that much more careful, particularly in this day and age, right, where people can video record us. We have no idea, right, where our words are going to end up today, which is a lot different than it was, maybe 30 years ago. But today we don't have a whole lot of control over that. And so we need to be more mindful, certainly, of that.
Absolutely. I'm seeing some questions pop up. One of them actually came in a direct message, so not everybody can see this. But Morgan McLean asks, why did you decide to write a book about politics?
Oh, wow, great question. Um, Primarily, it was for my class. As I went through the literature preparing for a class like this, I realized that there weren't really very many books, particularly at the time. Even today, there aren't that. There are a couple more, but at the time, there were virtually no books from a communication perspective that looked at um, these that looked at polarized politics, and so I felt that not only was that a glaring gap in the literature that needed to be filled, but also really I wanted to develop something that would be a useful resource for my students, something that they could go to in just one place and find a lot of this theoretical stuff that I'm talking about tonight, but it also really in-depth analysis of major contemporary social issues that are often divisive. And so that was the real motivation. It was really for my students and for the class. Since then, the publisher that I use is really geared toward an academic market. So I know that the book has been picked up by some other professors at other universities, but there have been some other folks outside of the university setting who have taken a look at the book. I wish that there was more of that, because I would really like to make this a much larger conversation, even outside of academia, because I think everyone needs to talk about this. But unfortunately, that's not happening just yet, the way I would like it to. But maybe that's the next step. I know that we have a question in the chat here from Jatavia, who asks, what is the best practice for walking away from conversations like these that may occur during work with superiors? How do you negotiate that? Hold on. How do you negotiate that so that you do not, if you do not want to engage or discuss it during working hours? Okay. Wow, that's an excellent question, Tavia. And certainly almost everything that I talked about tonight is context-based. So yeah, it's really good that you're picking up on that, because it really does depend where you are and to whom you are speaking, how you deploy some of these suggestions and tactics, right? With a supervisor, you obviously need to be careful. And I think it might depend on what kind of relationship you have with your supervisor. If it's already a power disparity, unhealthy kind of relationship, then yeah, I mean, which kind of sounds like that's what your question is hinting at. Yeah, I would try to avoid it at all costs. I would try to avoid taking the bait. If they asked me questions like, well, can you believe that the Democrats did blah 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 yesterday? I would probably just kind of nod my head and turn around, or try to pivot somehow. Saying, well, I'm not really sure how I feel about that, but I do know that I could really use some help on this assignment that I'm supposed to work on for work today. Whatever that work assignment is, or that's a really good question. Maybe we can talk about that sort of thing after work at some point, so that you try to remind the boss that there are boundaries that you would like to have respected, you know. Um, but yeah, it probably depends largely on that kind of environment. Now, if it's a really unhealthy environment and the kinds of questions or the kinds of conversations they want to have with you, you think really do cross a line, then I would encourage you to um, try to get some other folks present so that they can be witnesses, and start a paper trail. Start dialoguing and journaling that, hey, on such and such a date at this time, I had this kind of conversation, and so was also present. Because you never know, like in the future, if it gets really out of hand, if you need to go to HR or litigation needs to be followed or something like that. And then if you have that kind of a paper trail, then you don't have to recall it all from memory. And it also obviously helps if you have witnesses present, right? So again, it depends on the situation and the context. Emily, did you have a question? Emily Easton? You're muted. Are they able to unmute? Oh yeah, there we go.
I just did, sorry.
That's okay.
I did just type it in the chat, but
Oh, sorry.
I'll just go ahead and ask. You mentioned you assigned a paper where your students had to analyze extremists on liberal side and conservative side. I was just wondering how often you saw the minds of your students shift or change towards the other side after they wrote these papers and analyzed these polarizing figures that you were talking about.
Yeah, it's a great question. To my knowledge, I don't think anyone's changed their perspective, their political ideology as a whole. I have had students, however, who have come to me afterwards and said that they have lowered the temperature. They've become a little less adamant and maybe a little less boisterous in the way they talk about their political beliefs, knowing that, having studied it now, knowing that it can have some really negative impacts, and that it's just not really worth it. I mean, it's fine to believe what you believe, and it's fine to even try to convince others, but you're unlikely to change someone's mind if you're calling them names or you're engaging in this kind of ugly type of rhetoric. So if that's your goal, then it seems kind of strange to me that folks would use those tactics because they rarely change anyone's minds. So a lot of these students were thinking, I still feel pretty strongly about being a liberal or being a conservative. But if I dial it down a little bit, maybe I'll get more with honey, right? As the saying goes, and I think that that's worked out reasonably well for them, and certainly they're having better conversations as a result.
So it looks like there's another question from Morgan McLean before we go to one of the faculty questions. And she asks, from a perspective as a student, how should I go about talking about politics with family members? And I know you touched on some of that in your book, but what are your top recommendations?
Wow. Again, I think it often depends, because I know that some folks have family members who will say things, but they really do it to just get underneath your skin. They do it on purpose just to kind of rile you up, and it's a form of teasing, which often gets carried too far, and it can become personal, and it can become hurtful. But then there are times when we have family members who are dead serious and feel very, very strongly about what it is that they believe, and feel very, very strongly that whatever it is you believe, is incorrect or inferior or whatever. And I think ultimately, Morgan, you probably need to ask yourself the question of, well, how important is it that I maintain a decent relationship with this family member? Because if it is important to you, or if it's important to maybe another family member who you're trying to appease, because I can imagine that happening, right? Like your mom doesn't want you to upset your uncle or whatever. Then I would just try to avoid the conversations with them, because ultimately the risk is too great. The negative consequences are too great to even engage with them. So let them, have their fun. Let them grandstand. Let them do whatever, and just bite your tongue. But if you think that you can have a reasonable conversation with someone, then I would encourage you to look at some of the suggestions in my book, because I think some of those can help you manage that sort of minefield, if you will, to have a healthy conversation with someone like that. But yeah, ultimately though, that would all be based on how you want to preserve, or if you want to preserve that kind of a relationship with that family member or not.
All right, so I've got a long one from Facebook, and not to pick on Dr. Craig, but he has a
Okay.
couple of issues to unpack here. And the first question he has says, could you speak to how we might engage in discussions about news we might hear on both conservative news and more liberal news, especially when it's so polarized? And so how do we work through those discussions about what we hear on the news? Especially if someone's offering, let's say, fake news, how do we reason with that person?
Wow. uh, thanks, Dr. Craig. What a fantastic question that is. And to be honest, I don't know if we have enough time to really do it justice, but here are a couple of my thoughts. And I know, Dr. Carpenter, this is actually right up your alley, so please feel free to chime in. Um, the first thing is that there's the first part of the question, which is how do we discuss the news that might not be entirely accurate, and what do we do about that? And one of my suggestions in the 20 suggestions I read from my book is to try to be as knowledgeable as we can. And so that certainly, and it also coincides with the other suggestion, which is to diversify our news sources. So I think that we have to be competent enough and knowledgeable enough to recognize when a news source is engaging in fake news, right? A lot of times we hear what's being reported and we don't know any better. And because they're a relatively trusted news source, or we watch them frequently, or whatever, it seems like it's probably legitimate, and so we run with it. But if we are more knowledgeable, or if we don't just confine ourselves to that particular news source, and we check those sources, or we expose ourselves to other viewpoints, and so we happen to know that other sources are not in agreement with that particular source, then we know then to question it. And ideally, we would want to question all news that we consume, but we don't have enough time in the day to do that, right? So we have to prioritize. We have to pick and choose. And if it's something obviously that's really important to us, then I would hope that we would not just rely on a single source, right? We would fact check it, and we would look at other places. And so if we are engaged in the second part of your question is, well, how do we talk with someone who's relying on fake news for their position? That's a really tough one, because um, if if they feel very, very strongly, then they're going to just be defensive if you call them out, right? And if you call out their sources as being fake, or inaccurate, or ideologically bent, they're just going to be defensive about it. So a creative solution might be to just ask them questions about it. Say, well, do you know where that source got that information, or how was that? How were those facts discovered, or what makes you think, or why do you think that this particular source is reporting it this way? Those kinds of questions that get at the sort of deeper level of motivation and analysis, then might reveal or open up some spaces that then you can follow up, and maybe get at the issue, sort of indirectly. But I think that if you hit it straight on, it's probably not going to be very effective. Dr. Carpenter, what are your thoughts?
Oh goodness, and I think to kind of shift the gears on that question too, Dr. Craig followed up asking, how do some of these strategies work when we engage with social media? And I think that's a prime place where just disinformation runs rampant, and because it's so easily spreadable. And one of the things I really encourage people to do is to find ways, first of all, and it sounds counterintuitive. Here's the person who studies social media all over campus all the time, right? But to find ways to really put yourself on a social media diet. It's kind of this balance of the need to stay informed and the need to stay sane. And uh, and taking breaks from it makes such a difference. And I say that because social media are designed to keep you in those spaces, and designed to make you feel very strongly in those spaces in order to keep you there. So it's not just that things are happening quickly; it's that it feels like big things are happening all the time. And so finding ways to step back from those and just consume something else, it can make a tremendous difference. But that said, again, we still have to be informed, and I think there is an element to me, or an element to which I need to remind myself to take time, right? And I think that's one of the recommendations you've made, Dr. Zompetti, that you have to step back in a conversation. Now think about
Mhm.
that in terms of your own consumption and production of social media as well. It's so easy to want to retweet something the minute you see something that says breaking news, and to be the first on the scene to tell the rest of your friends how awful the opposition is. And see, it confirms all my views right away. And for you in that social media environment to not do that, and to hold off, and to wait, even like a couple of hours for the news itself to settle down, for you to then share something that's more informed and accurate. And that takes so much practice. And so it's probably not the best analogy, but I think that social media diet notion, right? Like balancing the need to stay informed with the need to stay sane is so important. And I think I will read and I consume a lot of content, but I end up not posting as much as I used to, especially over the past 6 years. as it feels like things have really gotten heated in the United States, from that very perspective that just says slow down before you react and engage.
Yeah. Again, what a great piece of advice, just in general, and not even in terms of political conversations, but just conversations in general, and that is to show restraint, right? Show restraint. Don't automatically, say what first comes to mind. Don't automatically share something on Facebook or retweet something. Think about it, digest it, marinate on it. Think about the implications of what that retweet or that posting will do, uh, and then after you've thought about it, then maybe go ahead with it, but or not. But so often we get ourselves into trouble because we don't have restraint. Other thoughts? Questions? Yeah, I don't have access to the Facebook posts. Has there been anything else, Dr. Carpenter?
Oh, you've got some great feedback from former students saying you're one of the best professors. And
Oh, that's
Dr.
nice.
Craig is saying that he's virtually snapping right now for the talk this evening. So, and yeah, we've been getting a little bit of feedback here and there, but no new questions there.
Okay. Well, that's all right. Again, maybe people are showing restraint, or or they're just trying to absorb, because we've talked about a lot of things here, and I think that a lot of what we've talked about tonight touches on just about everybody. Maybe not everything that we've talked about, but there's been a lot here that I think we can all relate to. I mean, I know that I'm guilty of a lot of this stuff, and and I'm a work in progress. I'm certainly not perfect by any means, uh, and I think that that's really all we can expect out of ourselves. None of us are going to be perfect at this. It's a process. It's a journey. And I hope that as a community here at ISU, we can kind of do this journey together. This certainly, again, I'm not the only person on campus who talks about this stuff, and I'm certainly not an expert on everything. And so I hope folks will avail themselves of the resources at the Center for Civic Engagement and CTLT and some of the other departments on campus that talk about these things, so that we can continue this conversation, and that we can help each other. Some of you may have advice and suggestions that I haven't thought of, and I welcome those. I hope that you'll send me an email and say, "Hey, Dr. Z, I really wish that you would have talked about something that's really been bugging me, or something that I use that helps me that you didn't talk about, or I really think that some of your advice was just poppycock, and I just don't think it works. And here's why. Any kind of feedback like that, I think is useful and will help me. And then as we have these conversations with each other, they'll help all of us, right, as we move forward. Um, eh, and I also hope that people don't feel like they have to do this by themselves. Clearly some of these conversations that you have, particularly like what was it, Morgan, who was talking about her family member, yeah, unfortunately she's going to be on her own in that situation, but hopefully she'll take some solace with knowing that and at ISU, she has a community of folks who knows what she's going through. And if she needs to pick up her phone and email one of us for some help, she can do that. Or if she comes back from, well, we don't have a spring break this semester, but in the fall, if she comes back from Thanksgiving break and she had that ugly conversation with her uncle, she can share it with us, right? And so that we can learn from it, and that the next conversation she has with her uncle maybe won't be so ugly. And that's how this works. There is no magical formula. It's chances are you're not going to avoid ugly conversations, for the rest of your life. Uh, and so you just, with practice and experience, do the best you can. And hopefully, as a result, not only do you get through these conversations, but also hopefully we can make the world a slightly better place, less toxic, less hateful, less ugly. And we can learn from one another, and instead of being at each other's throats. Yeah, thanks for putting my email in the chat box for everyone to see. That's good. Feel free to email me. I welcome your comments, your suggestions, your criticisms. I appreciate anything that you might be thinking about. And so, yeah, let's give it a couple more minutes to see if people are still thinking about maybe formulating a question or if they have an idea about something. Um, but if not, we can always call it a wrap. No.
And
Let's
nothing
see.
new on Facebook either.
Okay.
So, no.
All right. Well, that sounds good. Well, again, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank the SOCPD. I want to thank the Center for Civic Engagement. Thank all of you for attending. I really appreciate all of you joining us. I appreciate the questions. And I appreciate the future questions and comments that some of you may have. So again, don't feel like we have to do this by ourselves. We're all in this together. And let's try to make the world a better place. All right. Thank you again, everyone. I appreciate it.